Hello, this is the 21st of February, the first seminar in this crisis situation class. We have Lucy Craig doing a presentation on good soldier Švejk, explain the mechanism by means of which Josef Švejk survived the murderous military machinery of the First World War. And as I'm recording this, I can see that we can't really see the text on the video, but just under this on Moodle, there will be that PowerPoint so that you can check it. Over to you, Lucy.
Thank you for the introduction, Jan. You stole my thunder. I was going to announce the presentation title again, which I will do anyway. So, good afternoon. Today I'll be exploring the mechanism by which Švejk survives the military machinery of the First World War in Hašek's satirical novel, The Good Soldier Švejk. So Švejk's survival through the harsh military command change slide, of the Austro-Hungarian Empire is not a simple feat, but if I have to put it simply, then I'll say that he does so by Švejking. It's a word that has come from Czech that's made its way into the English dictionary, albeit with a slightly different spelling, as well as into sociological usage. The definitions of Švejking, Švejk and Švejkism have all had slightly different specifics.
Okay. You sit here then. Okay. There's one and you sit there. Go on.
Some of which I've put on the screen, but for the sake of the PowerPoint being the way it is, I'll give an example of one of them. So Fleming and Sewell point to Švejking as an adaptive mode of resistance used under marginal circumstances such as the harshness of military command, as well as two definitions from the OED, noun and verb, showing the impact this novel has had on language. I boiled down these descriptions into my own definition that Švejking is the subversion of authority through feigned incompetence and absurdity. However, the Švejking is just as complex and multifaceted as its namesake. So we'll observe this as we continue to explore Švejk's survival mechanisms throughout the novel. So, critics have debated the extent of Švejk's incompetence since the novel was first published, and in Hašek's time this meant that lots of people came away thinking that Švejk was very face value, a silly hooligan, the everyman and the butt of the joke. But as time went on and the book and novel were revitalised through popularity in Germany, people began to see Švejk as a much more nuanced and complicated, cunning character, which seems to be Hašek's view as well. And I'll point to the postscript from the novel here, in which case it suggests that Hašek found and created Švejk to be a much more craftier individual than is often given credit. However, despite this quite cut and dry announcement that Švejk might not be an idiot, this is a complex character we are dealing with, and this debate is still open to interpretation. As such, some of the mechanisms I touch on today of Švejk's survival might seem incongruous, and you may find some more convincing than others, much like with his character. I'd like to highlight a key aspect of Švejk's personality in his Švejking, which is his absurd deference to following orders. He's a turncoat deference to following orders in this sense. And I say turncoat as if he's given a different order by a superior, he will likely follow it, especially if he can help himself out as he does so. A prime example of this in part 1 of the novel is when Švejk sleeps with Lieutenant Lukáš's mistress when she solicits him to do so. And as Lukáš has asked him to fulfill his mistress's every desire, Švejk obeys both of them, and in doing so is able to get a little something for himself as well. To a certain extent here, Švejk plays into the expectations of others, so he follows orders, but he can cleverly play into the assumptions of his superiors. So he's cast as an idiot, so he's been certified by the army psychiatrists, and thus he behaves in that role that has been prescribed to him. That's an expectation set by superiors.
If I may just interrupt very briefly, it's, as I was rereading it, it struck me again how incredibly, basically hostile and stupid all the authorities as depicted in the novel are. And so it seems to be kind of logical the way Švejk behaves, doesn't it? Or what would you do if you were kind of confronted by sort of psychologists or medical experts like these, you know?
Well, I probably wouldn't roll with it like Švejk, but yeah, I don't think I would have fared well in any other situation. But he follows this role that's been prescribed to him, and this is a method of survival and escape in itself, as he's deemed as an idiot, so nothing he really does necessarily matters. So whether he's a malingerer in this regard or not, it doesn't matter. Through Švejking, he can convince his superiors of his stupidity. And if his attitudes, because he's quite, again, a complex, contradictory character, if he does something that doesn't align with his stupidity, oh, well, this was a blip, he's just an idiot, it excuses his behaviour, so he can use the assessment of idiot to his advantage, not necessarily reclaiming it, but kind of pasting it over himself as a shield. But Hašek has also cast Švejk as a soldier for the front, which is deeply ironic, as he never actually reaches the front line, which shows the kind of dark humour we're dealing with in this novel. But the placement of fool here allows him to obey and subvert expectations according to his whims. But we must remember he's a comic character, so these ideals will fluctuate with Hašek's punchline. So we have to be careful when we are analysing this character. As Davis notes, it's a comedy first and foremost, and the humour exists in a domain of its own, which enables absurdity and anarchy to slip into the military machine, in line with Hašek's own wayward politics. Absurdity, then, is another method of Švejkism, which holds itself most visibly in Švejk's use of anecdote and storytelling. This lends to his idiotic categorisation, as he tells meandering tales in vague relation from their origins to frustrate, befuddle and confuse his superiors. As such, they excuse this behaviour, once again as stupidity, giving Švejk the opportunity to not quite get off stock free, but certainly dissipate some of the tension. So he is able to avoid punishment through this, he's able to survive through this mechanism. Or if the humour of the plot doesn't allow it, for example, at the start of the novel, he is sentenced to be executed, but through Švejking, he is able to skirt round the gallows and make his way on to the next part of the story. There is a story to tell after all, even if it is a meandering and picturesque one. I have a quote on the slide, but for the sake of recording, I'll read it out as well. An example of his meandering anecdotes. This is from part 1 of the novel, I think. "Why are you telling me this?" shouted Lieutenant Doob, who had been completely sobered up by this speech. "Humbly report, sir. It's not really the point, but I thought that while we're having this nice chat..." Here Švejk filibusters like a poor politician or a middleman, speaking just for the sake of it and to fill the air. He's buying himself time. And a bit of a reference that kind of eased me into understanding his character. If anyone's seen the show What We Do in the Shadows, you can kind of understand Švejk almost as an energy vampire that kind of gets a little bit of a kick out of annoying people, and but it's just in his nature. So he tells these meandering stories. Anyway, I found that useful when trying to understand his character. Maybe you will too. Moving on. The absurdity of his character and the meandering methodology of his survival can be seen as likened to the war itself. As Jan has said in our lecture on the novel, to the Czechs, the First World War was an obscenely stupid and pointless endeavour. Likely why Hašek's novel has remained such an influential piece of Czech literature, continually studied today to examine the cultural attitude of the period and the interwar independence. These descriptions of the war are not unlike descriptions that have been attributed to the good soldier himself, who can be seen, if we look into Hašek's deep irony, is not to eschew the comedy of the novel, as part of the First World War's murderous military machine. Therefore, it may be argued that he survives as he is a cog in the machine itself. New slide for this one. So, Švejk is an idiosyncrasy. He's adaptable and subversive as a character, and his ability to adjust to different situations whilst simultaneously remaining wholly himself makes him really hard to categorise. He's at once an idiot and a master manipulator, constructed to remain friendly, unfazed, and wholly engrossing. His adaptability as part of the machine is what allows him to survive so easily. Well, not necessarily easily, he does almost get executed. But where there is brutality, there will be dissent, either the overt stuff of martyrs or in the more subtle, nuanced Švejking we see in the novel, which is why the term has taken on use into everyday colloquialism. Švejk is a paradox. He's a blend of idiocy and loyalty. He may be rusty and temperamental as a cog in the machine, butting against authority that he aims to serve, a patriot, but also that is paradoxical in itself, as he's both lauded for his loyalty to the emperor, but also admonished for it as proof of his idiocy. He can't necessarily win, but he moves through nonetheless. Through this, he serves as the good soldier, showcasing the absurdity of war. As Pilek notes, absurdity can only be exposed by more absurdity, and Švejk is the through line for this argument. In his efficient incompetence, he is the perfect military fool that will follow orders senselessly as the war rolls on. Although Švejk never finished the novel, as he passed away in 1923, I believe the non-end of the story is pretty apt. It distinctly makes, kind of embalms Švejk's character. He's always the good soldier. He's always slowly edging towards the front but never quite reaching it, giving a sense that the war is endless, as many did feel in the interwar period. Švejk is a cog in the military machinery. He is rarely well oiled though, and may be seen as a potential saboteur. He's adaptable, follows orders to a T, he is tiresome and idiotic, which excuses his mistakes, but also enables his survival. On a large scale, he may be seen as an ironic depiction for the war. But this is a comedy, so on the smaller scale, the comic scale, much like Lada's little illustrations are peppered throughout the novel, he is a comedy hero, a piece of social commentary and a satirical fool, masterfully crafted by Švejk in the age of Czech independence and the emerging post-war movements of the absurd and the senseless. All in all, Švejk survives through the military machinery with his resistant Švejking, utilising other people's assumptions of him to his advantage to survive by way of absurdity and apparent idiocy, to highlight the irrationality of the Austro-Hungarian Empire and their role within the First World War. But I am curious, do you agree with the idea that he's a cog in the machine? I know that it's a bit more English literature-y than it is more history, but I hope that this has convinced you to some extent. And on the next slide, thank you for listening, I have all the sources that I have looked at when I was constructing this masterpiece. So there you have it.
Well, does anybody want to say anything? Like, what do you think? Is he a part of the military machine or isn't he then? Oh, this is really quite...
Yeah, I'm surprised I've got vision in this eye from walking past
Okay.
it.
Well,
I obviously think he's part of the machine, more of as an example of, methods that Czech citizens and soldiers were able to kind of subvert for a regime that they didn't necessarily believe in throughout the war.
well, it is an interesting question because obviously he's drafted and he's basically forced to sort of become part of the army. He's kind of subjugated to certain commanders. He's a kind of, servant to a particular officer. Now, I'm just looking to my ancient experience of living under communism, which was a dictatorship. And obviously, myself and I suppose everybody that I ever had any contact with was basically an anti-communist. Certainly were trying to, in a Švejkian manner, maybe to kind of frustrate we had to go along with it. So I wouldn't say that I obviously didn't support it, but I had to live in it. So I was a part of that system. There was this Czech dissident, and later the first post-communist president, his name was Václav Havel, he's now dead. And I think he was also saying that even though you were a dissident, you kind of had to buy communist milk, had to buy communist bread. You basically were a part of the system, you know. So I suppose I would, maybe with slight reservations, I would agree with what you're saying, I think, basically. What do you think? You are, yeah, go on.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree as well, especially because, you know, he's put into a system that he has no real way of actually subverting. So, you know, by being part of the military machine, or whatever you want to call it, he's able to survive under it through his, you know, his Švejking, as you were saying. Yeah.
Are we a part of the British system, even though we may not agree with it totally? I mean, do you agree with Keir Starmer? I don't know. Or, I mean, there are people who are Scottish here, maybe, who do not identify themselves fully with the overwhelming English majority. And it's an interesting issue whether, well, you are still a part of it. There is also a very interesting thing. I was thinking of something quite horrifying. One of my daughters teaches Latin at University of Southern California, right? She's been there for some years. And now we've got Trump in America with his absolute authoritarian nonsense. And I'm just wondering whether these universities in America are quite woke, as they say. And my daughter especially is woke. And it's really quite interesting to what extent she will be a part of this system. I know that California is different, but he is going to try to destroy it, basically. And I had this horrifying thought that obviously in my younger years I had to cope with the communist dictatorship, and she may now be facing absolutely the same thing in the United States. This is a horrifying thought. Thank you. Very well researched and also very well presented. Thank you very much. I'm not going to publicize the mark here because that's supposed to be private, but it's a good mark. And I have to say that history quite often raise their eyebrows over my marking that it's too good. But I think I keep telling them, well, you see, my courses are so incredibly interesting that really the best students come and enroll for them, so I can't possibly give them low marks. So anyway, so that's that. Let's have a look. Again, still, I wanted to use a bit of time looking at this, what I would say quite interesting, yeah, and we can turn it, rotate anti-clockwise. Very briefly, maybe not for the whole hour, but this English translation of this interesting article by this Czech philosopher Václav Bělohradský. Years ago, we were running here this journal which is called Scottish Slavonic Review. It's now coming out in England, called Slavonica, and we basically published this. I just saw on the social media that this man about this week was 81. So this is actually horrendous how incredibly ancient this is and how time passes. Anyway, the great success of Hašek's Good Soldier Švejk with the average reader has obscured the uniqueness of the book within the Czech literary tradition and its foreignness to all that Czech literature stood for before 1914. I also want to emphasize one thing that I remembered as you were talking about it. This book was written between 1920 and 1923, so more than 100 years ago. And one interesting thing which maybe only partially comes across in the English translation, it is incredibly colloquial, which of course, I mean, if you see some of the earliest sort of sound movies, even in English, or especially the British ones, you know that this wasn't the case. Everybody talked in an incredibly sort of upper class, stilted way. It wasn't casual at all. So this is one of the other aspects that it was kind of seen as outrageous because it's totally, the comic novel is totally kind of based on absolute colloquial speech, the way people actually spoke in that army. So just a small point. The domestication of Švejk produced notorious labels like a simple ordinary man from the folk, in whose direct unpretentiousness the author finds a welcome contrast to the attitudes of the ruling classes, that's what the communists would say, and a popular humorist, a representative of the indestructible folk Czechness. Now this interpretation was enhanced and strengthened by the famous illustrations by Josef Lada, you saw them, which totally exclude all interpretations of Švejk other than just quoted. As I told you, that I think that those illustrations are misleading, and I have quoted that incident that, I mean, if that girlfriend of that officer basically lured him into bed, as it were, I very much doubt if that she would have lured him into bed if he looked as he looks on those illustrations, right? So, Bělohradský argues that Švejk is much less folk-inspired than it might appear to be the case. He says that it is very much stylistically akin to the European avant-garde. There was this sort of actor, philosopher, comedian who recalled that in his first encounter, Švejk had struck him as something stunningly modern in a world still ruled by pompous and parochial officialdom. The world that loomed behind Švejk, one which in Voskovec's view had just tripped over its own long beard, comprised not only Austrian military uniforms, officials, various colleagues with blackened bald patches under their thinning hair, but also the Czech national costumes, patriotic dances, and nationalistic rhetoric. These mutually hostile worlds struck Voskovec as basically identical. The inanity of the nationalistic songs was in a way the same in the Austrian and the Czech camps. Švejk is a part of that European literature whose modernity lies in its having shed light on the deep and intrinsic relationships between all those feuding languages, customs, and viewpoints that coexisted within one epoch. None of Švejk's anecdotes is folk-like. All of them are instances of a complicated, destructive attitude which has nothing whatever in common to do with the folk tradition. The Czech folk tradition is baroque. Švejk's amorality is deeply alien to it. Let's look for the cultural background of Švejk's universality and for the sociological sources of his modernity. Švejk is universal because it is anchored in the culture and civilization of Central Europe. The unity of that civilization has been obscured, this was written under communism when the world was divided, by the political divisions of that part of the world. But this division cannot alter the fact that Švejk belongs not to Slavonic literature, but to the same city as Franz Kafka, to the same area as Robert Musil. These were the Austro-Hungarian authors. It is surely significant that the Czech writer Milan Kundera, who lived in Paris, emphasized that he's a Central European as against the East European identity that was being forced upon him. Whatever universal validity Czech literature possesses, it does so because it is fundamentally Central European. And Bělohradský asks here, how is the expression Central European civilization to be understood? If we use the standard definition of civilization as a set of cultural models of social behavior, which make up an environment shared by two or more societies, such an environment includes a common language or the commonly accepted use of several languages, the use of the same basic technology, the same laws and rules of decision-making, the same type of public opinion, the same everydayness, and a certain degree of religious and ideological unity. As against that, the word culture is used to denote the models of behavior limited to a single social structure. A civilization originates from certain elements of a particular culture, spreading beyond the confines of their original social structure. In this sense, we can speak of a Christian civilization, Catholic, democratic, or conceivably a rationalist civilization. Our contemporary civilization is technological, because technology is that element of Western culture which is transmitted to all other cultures and social structures. Discovering a civilization entails identifying the element of a culture most capable of becoming universalized, i.e. becoming an element that unifies a number of societies, thereby creating a commonly shared environment. And this is, I think, quite important and interesting. And actually, considering this, I really think that Britain is in the same boat, because Britain is also quite bureaucratic. Central European civilization can be defined as supra-legalistic, in the sense that officials, a legal code, an apparat, a central system of weights and measures, uniforms, rubber stamps, offices, state salaries and careers are the only universal factors around which and through which Central European unity and its ethos originated. And I have to say this was obviously the product of Austria-Hungary, because they didn't have anything else to unite them. But then, of course, it kind of lingered on in the interwar Democratic Republic, and then it was seized upon in a slightly different guise by communism. Communism was also incredibly bureaucratic. So, Austria-Hungary, says Bělohradský further, this multinational territory was never unified by language, history, a common culture, or by religion. Only the impersonality of laws and the precision of weights and measures imprinted the unity upon the Austrian state. Central European civilization is trying to answer the question, can a legal code, in its general sense of an impersonal precision, be the source of a universality? Is there not something nihilistic in this universal retreat to the law and into the uniform? To what extent is it permissible to dissociate oneself from what differs from the law and from what isn't precisely measurable? Now, theoretically, we could speak of a permanent absence of legitimacy that pervades the whole Central European area. There have been attempts to overcome this absence of legitimacy by constructing a perfectly impersonal, neutral legal code. This legal code is presumed to be the source of legitimacy, indeed to stand for it. Thus there emerges a classic ideology whose aim is to rationalize society by means of the state, to overcome the absence of legitimacy by constructing a system of perfect organizational apparats, whose neutrality and impartial precision could be shared by all regardless of their individual differences. But when the impersonal legal code assumes such a legitimizing function, it becomes grotesque. A state that regulates and runs society becomes overburdened, and the limits of the state rationality soon become obvious. Over and over again, natural energy keeps emerging from beneath the impersonal legal code, which, while impossible to classify rationally, is nevertheless both appealing and seductive. Beyond the overburdened law, we can clearly see those things that differ from the law, things that seemingly can be put into a uniform, can be neutralized and contained, yet a pyjama will always show even from under the tightest uniform. Even in the most thoroughly mapped out environment, something will always be there to defy the first attempts at rationalizing it. The First World War stunned people precisely because it showed the fragility of reason, of the centralized system of weights and measures, and the impersonal law. So, all this suddenly collapsed. Central European culture also became aware of the potential barbarity and inhumanity of this impersonal state-orientated rationality and its depersonalizing historical props, which obscure the real meaning of one's actions and one's personal responsibility for them, stylizing violence, cruelty, and murder into an historical necessity. the mass crimes that shook the values of the 20th century were the product more of infection by geometry in the devastated landscape of the state than of an explosion of some primitive instincts within civilized man. So, basically, it goes on, but I think you can see that this is a very interesting kind of analysis, and he argues that Švejk is that representation of the sort of what we can call moist humanity, the stuff that you can't, this kind of Freudian thing, the sort of instinctual behavior, which people do not behave what basically the law always wants. And basically it's immeasurable, it's impossible to define, and basically Švejk can be seen as a typical example of a kind of factor or a influence, impact, which destroys this pompous, legalistic sort of impersonal system. So, just wanted to add that. Anybody wants to add anything? Well, we're supposed to be discussing stuff, but I know that you're very quiet, but maybe you'll think about it and we can come back to it. Listen, what's the time? 39. Okay, so it's slightly earlier, but nevertheless, I'll call it a day. Come tomorrow, we are going to talk about yet another crisis author, Karel Čapek. As you know, I keep saying I've got about 4 or 5 of these topics. Now, this was the First World War horror and how to deal with it. Čapek, even though he starts kind of slowly, it's a novel written in 1936, and it kind of captures the sort of idiocy of nations in the late 30s, and we all know what it led to. And Čapek was an incredibly good psychologist. I've also in other courses dealt with his later drama and later film called The White Disease, which really basically deals with a pandemic coming from China and basically killing off mostly old people or older people over 50. Anyway, how can he have kind of envisaged that in the 1920s? Anyway, there's also Čapek is a person who I'll talk about it tomorrow. Who invented the word robot? He wrote this play, R.U.R. Rossum's Universal Robots. Mr. Rossum was an inventor, and he invented these robots, right? And Čapek actually, when he was writing this play, was thinking, what should I call these kind of artificial sort of automated beings? And his brother, Josef, painter, said, well, look, there is this Czech expression for hard work or sort of hard manual work, which is robota, right? So why don't you kind of turn sort of automata which do hard work into a robot? So he invented this thing, and of course that play, Čapek was quite popular in the English-speaking world. As I will be saying, he also was a keen gardener and wrote a book called Gardener's Year. And of course the English would love this, right? And if you go into a library and look at Čapek's Gardener's Year, quite incredible, in the 1930s, 17 editions in English, right? So he's totally forgotten now, obviously, in the English-speaking world. But nevertheless, this play, R.U.R., was premiered on Broadway, and this is how the word robot actually entered into sort of general use, and nobody really knows when you talk about robotics these days. And one other thing, since I'm talking about what a good psychologist, there was a Czech, I don't know whether he's still alive, everything passes so quickly, Czech fiction writer Ivan Klima, who wrote monographs about Čapek and regards himself as a kind of specialist in Čapek. And he kind of had in the 60s, early 70s, had a kind of quarrel with Čapek, who died in 38, right? So long after his death. He basically said that Čapek was wrong, said Klima in the early 70s, that he made these robots biological, right? That's total rubbish, said Klima in 1970. Surely everybody knows that robots will be mechanical and electrical. Amazingly, Švejk knew that they would be biological, because there is, of course, genetic engineering, all that. Klima, 40 years after his death, didn't know this. So I think all these things are quite interesting. So one final thought. Švejk often used science fiction themes and in order basically to demonstrate his arguments. And why I find this war with the newts, some weirdo man-like newts are discovered in the Pacific, and then capitalism takes hold of them, and basically it produces a catastrophe, because I mean the market principle demands millions of them, and anyway, we'll talk about it tomorrow. But the novel, The War with the Newts, is a kind of kaleidoscope of things, would-be documents. There are lots of kind of clips from alleged newspapers and from the 1930s. And I was really amused, again, Švejk, a brilliant psychologist, how there are these clips from Britain, and these British tabloid newspapers say, we absolutely have nothing to do with Europe. We are on our own. This was in the 30s, Brexit kind of atmospheres. Anyway, I'll stop. Does anybody want to say anything? Okay, to be continued tomorrow. Thank you very much.